Welcome to our channel, where Hollywood's golden age is more than just a memory, it's a world full of untold secrets. Today we're going to look at the life of Jimmy Stewart, who was a beloved leading man in films like It's a Wonderful Life. Stewart's on-screen charm made him a household name, but things weren't always picture perfect. Stewart shocked the world when he called off his wedding to singer-actress Dino at the last minute, which caused a lot of speculation about what was. Jimmy Stewart was born in Pennsylvania. His father ran a hardware store in the neighborhood, and his mother was a great piano player. As is often the case, you have to watch out for the quiet ones. Over time, people would learn more about him, but as the saying goes, good things take time to leave well enough alone. Everyone knew him as an actor, but many of the best people want to keep their private lives secret. The public rarely saw his private feelings, and he wasn't said to have many close friends, but the ones he did have all said nice things about him and helped him keep his privacy. You don't get to know Jimmy Stewart, he gets to know you. Director John Ford once said of the man, "He wouldn't have liked how connected we are all the time, now we can." Jimmy Stewart did not have a Twitter account. He was an American hero at heart and always did the right thing when the time came. Stewart wasn't the only Hollywood actor to join the U.S. Army during World War II, he was the first. His military career was pretty fun, which we'll talk about later, but his bravery inspired many others to give their lives to protect the world from Adolf Hitler and the Axis powers. He was the good guy in real life and on TV. Wow, what a guy who believed in daydreams. When he was young, adults around him called him an uncontrollable daydreamer. So he was never really a straight A student and usually got grades that were just good enough. Teachers and other adults who dealt with him talked about how smooth and nice he was. Some people who didn't think they were famous even said that his bad grades were because he spent too much time on his art. They would be so right. Jimmy Stewart didn't get married until he was 40, even though he was liked by many Americans and many women's dream guy. There are many reasons for this, which we'll talk about soon, but the most basic reason might be that he liked being single. A gossip writer once called Stewart the Great American Bachelor, saying that he was always looking for a date with movie star money and a famous face. You can understand why he took so long to find the right woman to marry. Everyone agreed that Jimmy Stewart could play the accordion very well. If that wasn't enough to make you love how folky it is, hear about how it all started. Someone couldn't pay for something at his dad's hardware store, so the man offered to trade his flute for money. His dad wasn't interested, so he gave it to his son. Then, the local barber sat down with young Jimmy and taught him how to play it. This sounds like something made up for a cheesy movie that might or might not have starred Jimmy Stewart. Does anyone else feel like Norman Rockwell? When Stewart was a kid, he wanted to become a pilot. He was always the kid with his head in the clouds. He did want his son to become a pilot, but he wanted to go to school and get a good education. Princeton University called Stewart a good kid, so he went to school and started getting a degree in design in 1928. He got a degree that he would never use in the long run, but he could still follow his interests. Stewart's thesis was about airport design, so even though he was temporarily stuck in a field he wasn't going to stay in for the long term, he could still show the dreamer in him. This is Fonda. Everyone needs a best friend, and he, behind enemy lines, said we'd talk more about Stewart's time in the military, and now we are. It was common for famous people to join the army to show support for the American GIs, but most of them only did it as a show and didn't actually fight. Stewart, on the other hand, wouldn't sit on the sidelines and insisted on being in the middle of the action. He didn't see why people should treat him differently just because he'd been in a few films. Again, Stewart's love of planes came into play, and people loved and knew him best, especially women, which makes sense since he was one of the biggest stars of his time. Ginger Rogers, Loretta Young, and other stars all had flings with the man, some of which were very intense and could have turned very serious, but none of them ever worked out. Young chose her backup man over Stuart in the end, even though it was a rough hit, and she wasn't totally wrong. The cute Stuart didn't seem like he would ever be tied down by one woman at the time. Stuart went on to become one of the biggest and most bankable stars of his time, but MGM didn't really believe in him as an actor at first. The studio hired him, but they saw him more as a silly, awkward freak than the main man he would become. An executive who didn't think things through called the young actor a lanky. At that time, most great guys were hot, well-dressed, and above and beyond what a guy should be. Stuart wasn't like those guys. He cared about people and seemed like he was part of the group. People loved him because they could see themselves in him and his funny films. Jimmy Stewart was known for being very skinny for most of his life. A lot of people were jealous of this, but it got him into trouble more than once. Because he was so short, he was put on the third-string football team in high. Poor guy had to run home and stuff his face for several days in order to make the bare minimum. The fact that he would do this for his country shows how dedicated and kind he is. It's possible that Christian Bale heard the story when he was just starting out as an actor and it inspired him. As was already said, Jimmy Stewart didn't get married and settle down until he was middle-aged. Some lucky turns of events could have made that happen much sooner, but alas they didn't. I know you're already crying, so grab some popcorn. Stewart had a crush on actress Margaret Sue. He liked her right away when they met in college. He tried hard to win her love, but fate had other plans, and she never returned the favor, but she liked him a lot, and they became very close friends. Before Mr. Frank Capra came along, Stewart's early career was mostly made up of small parts, but he did good work and had a hard time getting a big break. He seemed like he might only be good at that for a short time until Mr. Frank Capra showed up. Before Mr. Frank Capra, Kia spent a lot of time with Clark Gable, who was his creative inspiration, but when he wanted to switch things up, Stewart became his man Friday. He was in You Can't Take It With You because Kia hired him. Stewart loved Gable. Stewart won the coveted gold statue at the 1941 Academy Awards for his role in a movie with Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant. He must have had the best night of his professional life and the happiest night of his life. Well, that's probably true, but there's a big problem with the story. Stewart and his longtime friend Henry Fonda were both nominated, and Stewart, who was always willing to help others, voted for Fonda. A man with honors? Didn't we say there was more to say about the man's time in the military? Well, Jimmy Stewart not only became a colonel in the U.S. Army, but he also rose to the more prestigious rank of brigadier general. This is a big deal for Army leaders, let alone an actor who is also a fighter. In fact, Stewart is still the most senior in American history. People who served in the military should always stand up and show respect because that man is better than you. Oh no, Mr. Bailey. The movie It's a Wonderful Life is always shown at Christmas, and you can't miss it during the holidays because it plays on so many stations. It's made millions of people happy and inspired a huge number of versions, fakes, and copies. But even though we know it as a happy story, Stewart had just come back from the war and seemed stressed the whole time. He may have been upset because he didn't know if his job would continue to go well now that he was back. We'll talk more about that later. Donna Reed, who worked with him, said, "This is not a happy set, James and Edgar." As a personal hobby, he loved Edgar Allan Poe's writing. Poe was known for writing scary and strange stories, so it's hard to imagine someone like George Bailey coming home from a day of being a fun and friendly scamp and reading his work. Going back to The Thin Man, Stewart was always embarrassed to talk about what he did in the war. This makes a lot of sense, and many guys who went through the horrible things it caused have felt the same way. But it did have effects on him, both mentally and physically. After the war, Stuart's food intake dropped even more. He hadn't been a competitive eater, so he wouldn't eat much, and some days he would go for long periods of time eating only peanut butter and ice cream. This isn't exactly the normal way to live. While we've already talked about how Margaret Sullivan broke Stuart's heart by burying his agent instead of him, they were always the best of friends and worked perfectly together. She helped him come out of his shell and show the world what kind of person he was. Stuart had a rough start as an actor and often felt bad about himself. Executives were hesitant to invest in him because he didn't have much confidence in himself. She talked to studio heads about getting him roles in movies, and it looks like we can see it now, but Frank Copra was looking for someone to play George Bailey. For a while, both Stuart and his friend Henry Fonda were in the running, but Copra finally agreed that there was only one person who could do the job, a man who was almost always positive and good, like the character. In the end, California said, "I know one man who could play it," which was James Stewart. To be honest, my dear, Stuart had a number of famous relationships, but he was single for a long time. His relationship with Olivia Devon may have been the most famous. After being together for a long time, it looked like things were going to get really serious when Stuart asked her to marry him, but it wasn't meant to be. Stuart felt like this story. She turned him down and they broke up soon after. Devon ended up living with director John Huston instead of going to the chapel. Some of Stuart's ex-girlfriends may have been nervous about the idea of getting married to this guy, even though he was good-looking and liked by women. In 1942, Stuart was seen with actress Dinah. They were engaged, and everything was set for a white wedding and a happy ending. It didn't happen, though. As you may have guessed, Stuart changed his mind before they got to the church in Las Vegas, where the wedding was supposed to happen. The whole thing was called off indefinitely. He was very emotional, especially when he was working. Kim Novak, who played Stuart's co-star in Vertigo, said that Stuart would often stay emotional after the cut when he had just finished an emotional scene. It would take him a long time to get back to normal and get rid of the bad mood. He goes to Washington, D.C. It's hard to understand why everyone loved Jimmy Stewart so much. In many ways, he was like Tom Hanks back then. Even President Harry S. Truman liked him a lot. He was overheard saying, "If my wife and I had a son, we'd want him to be just like Jimmy Stewart." That's some pretty high praise from the leader of the free world. Imagine getting that kind of praise from today's leaders. The problem was that he didn't have as much of it as he wanted. While he was in the military, his hairline started to thin out, and it became more noticeable when he got back. Luckily, he worked in the movie business, where there's a department for that. If you've seen Stuart on TV or in films, he almost certainly wore a true at some point. It became important for him to keep up his on-screen look, getting third place on the American Film Institute's list of the best American male actors of all. We've already talked about Stuart's relationship problems, but he did end up happily married in the end. He fell in love with model Gloria Hattrick and married her in 1947. They got married in 1949 and lived happily ever after. But it never would have happened because he was so stupid. The first time she met him, he crashed a party she was at and made a fool of himself. Patrick's honest about the fact that he didn't win her over the first time. Eventually, they came to their senses and became friends. The rest of the story is a happy one. Fans from Pennsylvania gathered in his front yard one day to try to get a glimpse of the megastar they were dying to meet. Stuart wasn't happy, but he had to keep up his good name. He got rid of them in a way that was almost clever but not too condescending. He left his house to look at them, and then he turned on his sprinkler system without saying a word, getting them wet. They learnt their lesson when he went back inside after they left, and his good nature wasn't called into question. Since there was a 10-minute standing ovation, I know that the Oscars never start on time, but the story is better if you don't think about that. His answer was also very moving, and he was honest when he said, "This is the best award I've ever gotten, to know that after all these years, you still remember me, always pure heart off-screen magic." Stewart was best known for the magic he brought to films, but before films he helped make a whole different kind of magic. He came from a poor family, so while they were having fun, Alfred showed up. Stewart's parts in Alfred Hitchcock's great movies like Vertigo and Rear Window helped make movie history. However, Hitchcock delivered one of his famous low blows. Vertigo is now seen as a major achievement in film, but at the time it was laughed at by critics and not taken seriously by the public. It got bad reviews and didn't make enough money. Hitchcock said that Stewart was to blame for the movie's failure because he looked too old and wasn't in. Stewart was in the running for the lead role in North by Northwest, which he was about to start filming. He was excited to work with the British director again, but unfortunately Alfie turned his back on him and chose Cary Grant, who looked younger, to play the part. This left Stewart holding his hat in a strange twist. Grant is 4 years older than Stewart and will always be so. When Stewart was younger, he was the best playboy and single man in the world. Later, he became a great husband, and they stayed together for the rest of their lives after they got married, even though being married wasn't always great. That does say something. Love comes to different people in different ways. Some people find it quickly and easily, while others have a hard time. When Jimmy Stewart wasn't young anymore, he found a new, somewhat shocking home in Westerns. This interesting story is hidden in one of those shots in John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, in which he played opposite the controversial but famous John Wayne. Many people now think of this movie as a classic and one of the best of its kind. It's also one of Stewart's best works, from what I've heard. Things were tense on that side at the time, though, because John Ford wasn't a big fan of John Wayne. He didn't agree with the fact that Wayne had famously avoided the war and avoided being drafted. Ford was known to say things like, "How rich did you get?" while Jimmy was putting his life at risk. Stewart, on the other hand, did something. He tried to keep things calm and never said anything bad about his co-star in public. Instead, he always said nice things about him. When Stewart won his Oscar for The Philadelphia Story, he may have done the most Jimmy Stewart-like thing possible. That's why he gave it to his dad to show off in the family hardware shop. The problem was that his dad, who wasn't very artistic, didn't really understand what was going on. When Jimmy told his dad that Stewart had won an award, his dad asked, "I hear you won some kind of award." Dads are just dads sometimes. You know how a poet feels. Stewart was good at many things in his spare time, not just playing the accordion. One of the best things he ever wrote was probably an ode to his beloved dog who had died. One of Stewart's best performances was when he read poetry live on The Tonight Show in 1981. At the end, both Stewart and Johnny Carson were crying out loud. Look at war. Jimmy Stewart did have strong feelings about how Hollywood makes war films, even though he rarely talked about his time on the front lines. From what everyone said, he didn't like them at all. He was quoted many times as saying they were wrong. They were Stewart's main source of income, but he only appeared in 2 of them during. Stewart taught his children to be proud to be Americans and fighters, just like he was. He expected them to join the army and serve their country, which made people feel good. But it cost Stewart something he never could have imagined. His oldest son, Ronald, was killed in Vietnam in 1969 while on active duty. We love to honor war heroes, but we'll always remember what it did to people. Stuart thought about this loss all the time. Henry Fonda died in 1982, which was sad for everyone in the movie business, but especially for Jimmy Stewart. The two had worked as actors their whole lives and had known each other for a long time. They had grown up together, been green together, and done well together. In typical Stewart style, he chose to cry alone. It was both heartbreaking and beautiful in how short it was. I just lost my best friend, he said. Stewart won the Oscar for Best Actor for his role in the Philadelphia Story 32 years ago. That may not seem like a big deal now, but at the time he was the youngest male actor to ever win the award. Most actors were around 40 years old before they even came close to the gold medal. This record stood for 14 years, until Marlon Brando, an up-and-coming actor who was 30 years old at the time, beat it with his famous roll-in on the waterfront going to see Gloria. Things that are good always end, even a love as real as Stuart and Gloria's, and when Gloria died in 1994, Stuart was understandably devastated. His friends said he was lost at sea, and he died 3 years later. At the beautiful age of 89, Jimmy Stewart died of heart failure on July 2, 1997. His last words to the world were said to be, "I'm going to be with Gloria now," which meant an eternal goodbye from the heart. He was remembered as a specialist, but the love that came out of him in his last moments and afterward was amazing. His family and friends were all around him, and he was mourned by everyone in the country he loved, had worked for, and had put his life on the line for. President Bill Clinton. Jimmy Stewart wasn't always a good person. In 1939, he had an affair with Marlene Dietrich, one of his co-stars who was married at the time they met, while filming Des Rides Again. Things kept going from there. It's not a Boy Scout thing to do. Some stories say the water was even darker and deeper than that. Even though it's just a rumor, it's worth listening to. Dietrich had an abortion to save her job, and by extension, Stewart's. After they were done filming the movie, Stuart quickly broke up with her. People who knew him say he was never quite the same after he came back. They knew him as the nice guy from the movies, but there was always something on his mind. PTSD, which shows up as fear and shaking, is said to have affected him by different sources. He also lost some hearing from the loud gunshots, engine noise, and cannon fire. People who knew him also say he looked different. Hearing him speak, it was said that his parents were shocked at how thin he had become. He looked about 10 years older than he did before the war.